Hello, good morning, everybody. Um, how's everyone doing? No, it's pretty early and it's a long weekend as well. So I'm not sure whether many people will join today's class. Maybe they'll just be watching the lecture recording. Um, but I think it's really 3 minutes past our timing or scheduled time. So let's start. Um, and then maybe when more people join, they can catch up with what we have gone through. So for the benefit of everybody, those that are not aware, the GBA group, uh, the GBA marks have been released. So today's agenda will be to finish our last part of the lecture, right? And then we'll go through the GBA. And last but not least, we will answer any questions regarding the final exam as well. Right? So we have 3 parts. In terms of the lecture, I don't think it's as heavy as what we have covered in the past 2 lectures, so that's a good thing. Then we'll spend some time on the GPA, answer any questions if you have any, and then on the finals, we can either go through some materials that you have query about, we can review them again, or if you have some specific questions, we can try to answer them. So maybe we can kickstart today's lecture. Good morning as well to everybody again. Okay, so let's look at what we are doing now, right? So this is the last lecture. You have survived the 6 lectures and almost the end of the course already. You just have one final exam and then you're done. All the assignments are more or less there. Also, I want to mention that after today, I'll be posting your class participation marks. So at least you can gauge where you are and then gauge what grades you want, how much to study for your finals, right? So at the end of the day, university is quite strategic. So you know that you have scored pretty well for your continuous assessment. Maybe you can focus on other modules because I understand that most of you have other modules as well, and maybe the workload can be there. So I'll release the class participation marks as soon as the lecture is over, or maybe tomorrow, by end of the weekend, basically. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of what we have talked about throughout the 5 lecture and the 6 today. So this module we have been always focusing on portfolio management, right? And in the GBA we did or you did quite a extensive case on actually how do you do portfolio management. A lot of details given to you is like a real life case where you have a client giving you all the details and you have to basically formulate a portfolio, maybe in the case of asset allocation, for the client, right? And then how the process actually work. And so in our lectures, we have covered this whole component of IPS, and it's one of the key components of a GPA as well that you have to be written. Thereafter, we talked about quite a bit on forming a market expectation. We talked quite a bit about the economic factors, some frameworks, and then we went into some modern portfolio theory. Um, and some groups also use this modern portfolio theory to substantiate certain SAA or strategic asset allocation portfolio construction, because basically it provides a backbone to suggest what asset you want to allocate to, right? If not, without any theory, it's hard to determine what asset to allocate in your portfolio. You can't just plug the numbers out of the air, right? So based on certain theories, it can help you substantiate, okay, we want a corner portfolio, we want a tangency portfolio, etc., in order to determine what kind of asset allocation would meet the requirement of your client. Now, we have done some rebalancing as well. So recall in the last lecture, we talked quite a bit on how do we rebalance, the type of rebalancing, and we did some calculation as well for rebalancing. Not too complex. And so today is like the final lecture, and what we're covering is performance evaluation, right? So the final step of portfolio management is at the end of the day to determine if the portfolio manager has done a good job, right? And how do we determine that? We need to do certain kind of attribution in terms of, okay, where is the good results coming from and what are the not so good results, so that we can tackle or we can change the aspect of the portfolio management in order to improve the overall portfolio performance. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover today. So a key component of performance evaluation. Um, first, we need to talk about the performance attribution analysis, where we want to find out, okay, what is the cause of certain returns? Is it because of the manager's active management of portfolio, or is it more like just semi-active where a big portion of the returns are just market driven, right? Because the market is doing well, so the portfolio is doing well, right? So we need to segregate what proportion is due to active, what proportion maybe is just to market returns kind of uh, um, uh, effect. Okay, so uh, after we do the attribution, we need to appraise, whether the portfolio manager has actually um, succeeded or failed the goal of the client. And recall the goal of the client is documented in IPS, right? So that is the basis where we need to do our benchmarking in terms of, okay, is the returns requirement met? All right, so this okay, so investments allocated based on risk and return. We know that performance management. So these are the few questions that we want to answer, right? So what was the performance first? So we can measure returns a few ways, right? Why did it perform this way? So we need to consider this. We appraise the manager. Okay, is it due to luck? Is it due to skill? Is it due to those market changes? Um, who who should perform the who should measure the performance? Generally, it is either, let's say the head of department or basically managing you as a portfolio manager, right? So your head usually do the evaluation, or it could be also induced by the client. Maybe a client feel like, oh, the portfolio hasn't been doing well, it raised an issue to your boss, and therefore your boss wants to do an evaluation on your performance, right? So how often you should do it, and how do we measure the performance? Are we doing certain benchmarking, certain peer benchmark, meaning is it like to S&P 500, or are we talking about peer, right? So peer meaning that, let's say I'm BlackRock, am I doing a benchmark to, let's say, State Street, right? So BlackRock and State Street are two fund houses, so we can do a peer comparison as well. Or we do like a risk-adjusted model. Basically, what we're talking about here is more towards like a regression kind of model, more mathematical model, trying to explain what is the theoretical type of return that we should get versus what we actually receive. Right, so we'll go in detail. So this is just an overview. We'll go into details as it progresses slide. Right. So now let's talk about the first thing of performance management, and it's more of performance measurement, right? So how we measure performance, and there are a few scenarios. And before we go into details, the idea is that, okay, we know that there's changes in the portfolio value, right? But there are a few scenarios that will determine how we calculate the change in the value of the portfolio. And let's start off with the simplest example, where we do not see any cash flow. Meaning what? Meaning that there is no change in the there's no like cash that's coming in externally, right? So that means the client did not inject more cash. Well, let me just pause for a short while. I did some updates on the slides. So in case you're still using the old slides, so I did updates, I think yesterday. I uploaded it in the module. So in case you want to use the new slides, there are just some minor updates, and there's one portion that added additional method to calculate IRR. So in case you realize there's some changes here and there, yeah, it's just an update on the slides, right? And it's uploaded already. Okay, going back to this. So the simplest one is if you assume there is no additional cash flow injected into our portfolio, right? So no external cash flow, meaning the client is not going to inject more money. He basically put a sum of money there, and then at the end of the whole holding period is what the portfolio value is, right? There's no additional. So I think there's a missing minus here. There's a minus, right? So in this case, measuring the returns of the portfolio is pretty simple, right? We have what's the portfolio value at the end minus what the portfolio value at the beginning divided by what's the portfolio value at the beginning, right? So this is the most simple example. It's just what's the change of the portfolio value. Okay, this is if there is no external cash flow. I think for this, probably everyone will be okay with it. Now, let's think about two scenarios where there are some cash flows happening. In the first scenario, there is some external cash flow happening at the beginning of the investment period or the measurement period, right? So in this case, if there's some external cash flow happening at the beginning, what happens? Because this cash flow is injected at the beginning, the cash flow that is injected will also grow, right, based on your asset allocation. And so the concept is that, okay, we just add the cash flow and the beginning kind of portfolio value together, right, and determine what is to change after that at portfolio value MV1, right? So we just take MV1 minus what's the aggregate initial plus the cash flow divided by initial plus cash flow, right? So it kind of, I hope this makes quite simple sense, right? If you have an injection at the beginning, that amount that is at the beginning basically helps you generate returns as well. And so we put it at we put it as a MV0 plus cash flow. Okay. So if the external cash flow is injected at the end, now if it happens at the end, meaning that this cash flow has no chance to generate returns, right, in your portfolio. So what should you do? You should remove it. So in this case, if it happens at the end, you should remove it. So you see a negative here. So you remove the cash flow from the portfolio value at the end, right? It can't make sense as well because this, if you inject it at the last day, obviously that cash that you inject at the last day will not generate any value for your portfolio. So you should just remove it. It's not important. You should ignore. Now, so we have done so-called three simple examples of how we calculate the returns. Can you repeat what do you mean by external? Okay, external cash flow. So there's a definition here if you want to refer to. So external cash flow basically means any additional contribution or any withdrawal done on the portfolio account, right? So it's not equals internal cash flow. So internal cash flow is like there's dividend received, there is maybe bonds received if you are investing in bonds. So yeah, it can be a top up or it can be a withdrawal. Yeah. So that means changes in the portfolio. So I mean the client approach you to say, I want to do a withdrawal or I want to add more money in my portfolio. Right. So that's external. Okay. So we have done three very simple examples of returns. Those are kind of the simplest. Now let's do a bit more sophisticated, right? Because we are in finance, that is just very basic like mathematical kind of returns calculation to determine the performance of the portfolio. Now let's do this thing called time-weighted returns, right? So in short, we call it TWR. And I guess it's a bit more sophisticated, it's more important in the sense that, maybe in the finals, you might see something like this. Because it tells your concept more, right, than what we see in the last three slides earlier. So the idea is that we are going to use the concept where we treat each injection of cash. Okay, let's think about the concept first before we go into the details, right? Before we go into the mathematics. Idea is that let's treat each injection of money as one time frame, one period. Okay, and so when there's an injection of cash in one period, that's one considered one time frame, And then the second time frame, maybe inject some more money. That's time frame 2. And then inject the third time is time frame 3. Right? There will be example, and then you will see the numbers. I can't understand it more better. But the idea is that we want to treat each injection individually as each sub period, as we see here, right? And so when we inject cash at the first sub period, we need to determine what is the returns, okay? And we get the percentage, and then when we inject cash in the second sub period, we determine what's the returns, and then we multiply them together. We call them chaining this, called a chain effect, or basically a compounding effect of the returns in each sub period, right? And this will give you the time weighted returns. Okay. Maybe you have some questions. Okay, what does this really mean? So we do have an example here, and with the example, it's a little clearer, right? So Mary has an investment account with a local firm. She makes contribution to account as the fund becomes available. Self-employed Mary received money from the client on irregular basis. Okay, she began the month of September with a balance in the account of 100,000. Okay, and she received some funds of 3,000 and made a deposit in the account on September 14. Next, she received payment of 2,500 on September 21st and make another contribution. And the value of account after the first contribution is this, after the second contribution is this. Now, I hope you can see that, yes, okay, she contributed 3,000 at the start, on the first so-called sub period, right? But you notice that after the first contribution, there is some increase, right? Because the portfolio is also growing, right? As you contribute, it's also growing. So there is some increase that's happening here. And this is what we're supposed to determine. What is the return on each sub period? So in this case, we have 3 sub period, right? First contribution as 1 sub period, second contribution as the second sub period, and then you say finally at the end of the month, this is the amount. So we have a third sub period. So we have 3 sub periods here. Any questions first before we go to the numbers and calculations? No? Thank you. Okay. Okay, so the calculations are like this. So in the first sub period, we know that after the first contribution, her account has 105K, right? And she made a contribution of 3,000. The initial contribution is 100K, the initial amount there. So we want to determine what's the returns. So we just take 105 minus 3,000 minus 100K, which gives us 200, right? So this will give us, basically, there is a 2K, right? Basically, this 2K is the returns in the first period based on the growth of the portfolio, right? And so this 2,000 divided by the initial amount will give you 2%. We do the same for the second sub period, where we know at the end of the second sub period or the second injection, the portfolio value is 108K here. We know that the second injection she did 2,500 as seen here. Now, the beginning of the portfolio value was 105. And so we determine that, okay, based on this, the less it off, I think it's around 500. We have 500 here. Okay, based on this, we have 500. And we divide by the initial value, and this is what we get. That's the return. Last but not least, we know that at the end of the month, this is the portfolio value. During the second sub period, the value is this. And so we can determine what's the return on the last period to the end of the month. So once we have gotten the 3 returns, we chain the returns up or compound the returns up in the sense of just do a simple compounding like this. 1 plus the returns times this, 1 plus times 1 plus the return times 1 plus the returns minus 1. And this is basically what you get for your time weighted. Maybe I'll pause for a short while. Any questions? All right, so thank you. So you can see that so going back to the introduction slide on the time weighted returns, right? We are treating individual um, injection of cash as sub periods, right? And we can see here there are 2 injections, and then the final one is there's no injection, but it's just at the end of the month, what is the value. So because of that, we have 3 sub periods, and we chain the returns together, or compound the returns together to give you your returns based on TWR. Okay. Now, have you understood that? Let's go to the next one, the next return called money weighted returns. Okay, so the money weighted returns is also known as internal rate of return. And so in IRR is basically what we have covered in your FIN 203, where you calculate IRR of various projects, right? So it's what you have covered before, but it's just a different name for it. And the idea is that, as a small recap, right, of IRR, is that we want to determine what's the discount rate that will make our investment or your net present value equals to 0, right? So recall what's happening in, okay, so before we go into all this detail, recall what's happening in your FIN 203, right? We have this thing called net present value, and then we have certain, cash flow that's coming in, cash flow 1 plus cash flow 2 plus blah, blah, blah. And the idea is that we want to discount this cash flow by something called, let's say, 1 plus R, and we discount it by 1 plus R and square because it's the second period. And the idea is that we want to find what is this value of R here, which is called the IRR, that gives you an NPV of 0, right? This is just a recap of what we have covered in your year 1, right? This is IRR, internal rate of return. That's the meaning of it, right? But now in this case, we are using it to measure the return on the portfolio. Okay, and how does it work? Because the idea is that by taking account the NPV of the portfolio, we know that if you inject cash inside, when you inject money, money is coming out of your pocket, right? So it's negative to you. What you receive is positive to you, right? So it's a positive inflow. So if you know what's the positive at the end and the negative that you inject in at the start, we can determine what is the returns that is giving you the difference, right? So what is happening now is that we are compounding, or we actually not discounting all the cash flows to the start so that we can do a comparison. We determine what is the returns. So that's what IRR is doing. And this is what money weighted returns is doing. So we compound the growth rate of the value of all the funds invested over the evaluation period, right? So you can compound it or discount it the same, but for NPV, to understand it in NPV way, it's a discounting. And then we compare what is the value, what's the amount we put in the negative form, and what we take out at the end of the investment period. So there's a comment here, the rate of return will link the ending value of the account to the beginning plus any intermediate cash flow. So what happens to intermediate cash flow? Remember, of course, given you're in the finance field, you cannot just add the intermediate cash flows, right? We have to either discount it because we are shifting cash flows from various periods, as you have learned in your introduction modules, or you compound it if you are shifting it backwards to the future years. Okay, so how do we calculate IRR? So IRR is calculated by doing this. So to know what's IRR, you need to know what's MPV, right? Uh, I actually have my 203 slides here because just in case somebody asks, let me see if I can just slide over to what's IRR here. Regions. Okay, so I like to use this diagram. So this is basically your 203 slides, FIN 203, right? And what you see here is MPV. So MPV is net present value. So what you're doing is you have a summation of your cash flows at your WACC, right? So basically we calculate what is the net present value of all your cash flows so that we determine, in this case, in your 203, is to determine the project's returns, right? Whether you should accept or reject a project. Now, what's IRR? IRR is by making the NPV equals to zero, what is the returns on the cash flow, right? Remember that in a project, your project has an initial investment, which is a negative cash flow, right? Negative, let's erase this, negative CF, right? So in simple sense, it's let's say negative $30. Now, there's negative 30, and then you as you have the project, you earn maybe let's say $50, right? So what is this plus IRR? What is this IRR here that it can be discounted by, I don't know, let's say that's 3 years, right? Let's say 3 years, right? So what is this value here that would discount the $50 so that it becomes nets off to zero? So it will become um, so that it will become $30, right? This is a hypothetical example. So that if it's 30, 30 kind of nets off to zero, right? So that's what IRR is calculating. Oh, WACC. So if in case you have not done this module, so WACC is your weighted average cost of capital. So your discount rate basically. It's in simple terms of discount rate. But why is it so long WACC, weighted average cost of capital? Because we know a firm has both debt and equity, and even preferred stocks, and it's being weighted average, right? So we know how much percent is in debt, how much percent in stocks as well. So it's called weighted average cost of capital. So that is what IRR is calculating. So you find a rate of return that links the ending value of the account to the beginning of value of the account plus any intermediate cash flows that's happening. Okay, yeah. So how to decide ROI? So it really depends on the assessment used by the firm. So some firms like to use IRR, some firms you're right like to use ROI or even CAGR, right? So those are different measures of returns. And you can use any of them or opposite of them as well. So it really depends on, and there's pros and cons on using each methods of measurement. Okay. So this is how we calculate. We have an example in the next slide. So just to understand um, how we calculate, we can first determine, okay, what is the initial final value of your portfolio here at the end. And we know that there maybe the portfolio is held for 5 years, right? So we have T as 5. And then we know that, okay, what is the value of your initial portfolio value? You compound it by the M, which is the number of years, plus any cash flow that's happening in between, and you compound everything, right? So whatever you compounded must be equals to your final portfolio value. Now, this is just the first step, right? So we need to find what is this R that you have done to compound your initial market MV0 or initial value of your portfolio plus any cash flows in between, and all compounded by this value of R, which is what we need to find, so that we can get a MV of MV1. Okay. Okay, let me finish this first, then we answer the questions. And then the thing is, once we are able to find out this R here, to calculate money weighted returns, we need to take 1 plus the R value that you have formulated minus 1, right? So basically what we're doing here is we annualize it, or whether it's an annual or is it monthly, we bring it up to a base where we can determine what's the internal rate of return for the evaluation period. Okay, we have an example to explain the step-by-step way of doing it in the next slide. Okay, so I see a question. What are the pros and cons of IRR? So ROI. So this one you can simply Google it, but just to do a quick kind of explanation, it's not fully comprehensive. I encourage you to just do a Google and search. Is that IRR? The thing is, you assume one of the cons. I would say you assume that the dividends or your accounts, basically your cash flows, are reinvested at IRR rate. And this might not be the case, right? In a sense, what does reinvested IRR rate mean? It means that let's say you get a dividends, you get a coupon from your bonds. Chances are you're going to put this money either in your money market meaning something that's like liquid like cash, or you reinvest it in a product, right? But the chances of you reinvesting it at IRR rate, which is the rate of your portfolio return, is very slim, right? Because are you able to divide this small little, let's say $50 to all your asset in the portfolio to make sure that it's balanced? You might not be able to do so. So that's one of the issues with IRR, right? Another thing about, let's say, ROI. So ROI is a very simple way of calculating, right? It's just a ratio. Does it capture more complex companies that, let's say, are large conglomerate? They have different segments. They need to calculate segmented ROI, do the comparison, etc. So there are multiple kind of issues with it. You can do a simple Google and you can find quite a bit of solutions from that. Yes. So we can, and in the next slide, I'll show you the example of how to do it. So is the update that I've done in the slide. So in case you are using the old slides, there is updated slide that I posted yesterday, just for this the last lecture. Okay, so we have this example here, which we will explain how to use the IRR formula in Excel to calculate. Okay, so in this question, the client account is valued at 750K at the start of the month. On the 22nd day, a contribution of 20K is made, right? At the end of the month, the account is worth 1266513. Assuming a 30-day month, what is the money weighted return for the month? Right? Okay, so we have some ABC. Let's do method 1 first. So method 1 is using the IRR approach. And let's just zoom in a little here so we can see clearer what's happening. Okay, so we know there are 30 days. Given there are 30 days, let's just put all the 30 days here, right? And we know that day 0, which is now, we have 750K. On day 22, as shown here, at day 22, we have an injection of 20K. And in between, there are no cash flows happening. Now, the first method is the easiest method to do it, and I encourage you to use method 1. And what we do is we simply use the IRR formula, and we just highlight the entire stretch here, right? However, there's one thing I want you to take note. We need to consider the in and outflow of money. What does this mean? It means that, so this is going back to your FIN 203 again. It means that at the start, there's an inflow of money, right? So it's positive. At the end, and there's an inflow here as well. That's positive. At the end, you take out the money. So this must be negative. I put this, you can see here, this is a negative here. So if you don't put negative, you won't get the right answer because the IRR needs to net off, like what we mentioned. I'm just going to flip here. It needs to net off like this here, negative 30 to 30. Right, so there must be a positive and a negative to net it off so that we can determine the NPV of zero. No, so that we can determine what is the rate that gives NPV of zero. Is that clear? Is that clear for everybody? Okay. All right. Very good. So once we do this, we determine what is the IRR using the Excel formula. Very easy. Once we have plotted the cash flows, and given that the money weighted returns is given by the formula because we want to, in this case, make it for the entire month, right? Not in days, because this is in days. Right? This IRR is a daily IRR, but we want a monthly IRR, right? So that's why we plus 1 to the power 0, sorry, to the power 30 and minus 1 here. So this is the money weighted return. So this method 1 is the simplest method. Now, method 2. Okay, so why I do method 2 is sometimes the way the question phrase might force you to do method 2. So that's why I choose to cover method 2. And method 2 uses this formula. So method 2 uses the formula stated here, right? So the idea of, okay, we have initial value MV0, we plus various cash flows compounded to finally give you MV1. And from there, we try to use a try and error guess method to calculate what's R here, right? So this can be done in Excel. It's relatively easy. So we create a sheet first, right? We know that there are two cash flows happening. Initial cash flow, and then there's a cash flow that happens, and we just call it CF1. Okay. We don't know what is the rate R, right? There is something, there's R here that we need to solve for. And when we know that when we multiply, let's say this R, right, with this cash flow, it should give you your MV1. So when you multiply R plus the cash flow and the second R plus the other cash flow, it should give you this MV1 here, right? But now this is setting up the sheet first because we need to use the solver to do it, right? So we are just setting up the sheet. And this is your to so-called convert the daily rate numbers that is given by solver to a monthly figure, right? So that's why it does create power 30. Having set up our sheet, we do the solver, right? So hopefully it's not new. Everyone have used solver before. Basically, we set the objective of our final MV1, and we set objective this amount, which is given in the question, right? And where do we want to vary the cells? We want to vary this portion here, right? Your rate. We need to create some constraints because we know that the R rate must be the same for both cash flows, right? In this case, there are only two rate. The R rate is the same. We also know that the R rate cannot be more than 1, right? Meaning the percentage, right? It's like 1%, 2%, etc. Right? It cannot be like 100%. So we need to set the constraint here. Okay. Once we set the constraint, we just click solve, and voila, we get the rate here, right? And once we are able to get R, we simply can calculate your money weighted returns. So I would say use method 1 is a lot faster. There's less chance to make mistakes. The only thing you need to be careful is that you need to be careful on the sign convention. For method one, you need to put a negative, right? In whether it's money coming in, money coming out. So you need to make sure there's negative so that there can be a net off when you use the IRR formula in Excel to do it. If the question does not specify, use method one. I have not seen a question specifying you to use method two or method one. Most of the time, they give you the liberty to choose. So try to use method one. But of course, you never know, right? So better to understand how to use both method one and method two. Because you never know, maybe a question might be nasty and say, use how they would phrase it is like this, right? They say use the formulation given here, let's say this formulation here, to solve for R, right? So if they say, use the formulation given here, then this formulation here is quite, is closer towards the solver method, right? Not the IRR method. It's 30 days based on the question. So you need to read the question carefully because they say assume 30 days in a month. So sometimes it can be 31 days as well. So it depends on the question. Okay. All right. So now there's a bit of a comparison between here. Sorry. Time weighted and money weighted. Right. So the idea is that there's some explanation what's happening. If you understand what's time weighted, what's money weighted, is kind of make sense. So money weighted represents the average growth of all the money invested, while time weighted is the singular unit invested. So remember this, why do we mean a singular unit invested? Is because we look at individual sub periods, right? What is the return in sub period, and we multiply or we chain them up together, right? But money weighted, we take all the money invested, right? All the cash flows. So there's some comparison. Money weighted is sensitive to the size and timing of external cash flow because we look at the days, right? In the last example, you look at which day the issue happened and which day actually affects the discounting of the cash flow, right? Because when we discount cash flow, we need to do like 1 plus R to the power of something, right? So depending on where the cash flow is, the power will change. So it's affected by size and timing. But time weighted is not, right? Or this is a typo, it's TWR, not TMR, right? So it's a typo there. That is not affected by it because we look at sub periods and we do not determine, we do not talk to the power of whatever sub period is. Okay. Time weighted requires count whether every date the external cash flow take place. We have seen this in the example that every time there's external cash flow, we need to determine the sub-period returns. Money weighted do not need, you just need to do the IRR method. Okay, time weighted accurately reflects how investor would fare over valuation period. This one is not so important. If the fund is contributed to or withdrawn in the current period, strong performance, then money weighted will be more positive and effect compared to time weighted. So what this saying is that because money weighted returns, you compute what is the compounded returns for the whole cash flow, and we determine the timing, determine the size that affects the calculation of IRR. That's why if there are funds contributed during period of strong performance, your money weighted, which calculates the injection of the funds and the cash flow for each period, this would result in a more positive number for your money weighted. Uh, so the question, so I've not seen a question that say you must use method one or method two. Most questions are open to allow you to use whichever method. Uh, so I guess yeah, you are safe in that sense. You can use method one because it's simpler. I encourage you to still know how to use both methods. Yes, yes. So the question will be very specific. Yeah, uh, time weighted or money weighted. So they will ask, typically they will say, please use the money weighted or please use time weighted to calculate. And then sometimes they would have like follow-up questions which rely on these, make some comments between money weighted and time weighted. So which should be used? So if an investment manager has little control over size and timing, use the time weighted, right? Makes sense. Because if you have no control, then the money weighted will be unfair to you, right? What if there's some large injection or large withdrawal at time of good performance? Then if you use the money weighted, it's going to affect your performance, right? So if you have no control, use time weighted. Time requires evaluation at every period when external cash flow take place, whereas money weighted accounts for it. Okay, this is just a definition, nothing much. Um, Market account to market frequently is administratively more expensive and potentially prone to error. So the idea is that if you need to do either the time weighted or money weighted very frequently, in this simple case, it's pretty easy to do it, right? You can do it in Excel. But imagine you have a portfolio of 100 stocks. Your portfolio is very big, and you need to do calculations for individual, let's say, stock, or sometimes it's too troublesome, we do it by sector basis. It can actually require a lot of time, and it's error prone. Now, the last method, and I guess fortunately, you do not need to know about the calculations, but you do need the concept of it, is that we combine the money weighted and time weighted. We call it the linked IRR method. And the idea of this is that we want the best of both, right? We want the best of time weighted and money weighted. And we know that time weighted takes into account individual sub periods. So what if we use the money weighted, so money weighted meaning the IRR, we calculate IRR for individual sub-periods, IRR2, IRR3, and we define the sub-periods, right? So meaning this sub-period can be 22 days. So each sub-period is 22 days, right? By determining the IRR for individual sub-periods, 22 days, we can actually link them up together using the time-weighted return, right? Because your IRR is just the return. So after we calculate the IRR, we use the time-weighted return to link them up together, meaning what? 1 plus IRR1 times 1 plus IRR2, 1 plus IRR3 minus 1, right? So we link them up together, and that's why we call it the linked IRR method. Again, your linked IRR method is a bit dangerous to large injection of cash flows between each period, right? Because it is sensitive to injection or withdrawals as your money weighted is. Yeah. So in this idea of the linked internal rate of return, typically you must have the same period. So it can be 22 days, can be 5 days, 10 days, but it must be the same so that we can link them up together. Yeah. Okay. So that's all for returns, right? Now let's talk a bit on benchmarking. Okay, so we have done performance measurements in terms of returns, right? We learned a couple of return methods. Now let's think about benchmarking because when we have a portfolio, we typically have to benchmark a portfolio that you have created for your client to something, right? And so you can compare the results. Oh, your benchmark performed this, your portfolio performed this. Is it following the benchmark? So a benchmark provides a reference point, right? And the performance results can be broken down into three components: market, style, and value added by active management. Okay, and let's understand each component. Okay, market returns. So what are market returns? So market returns basically is the return on your market index. So what's the market index? Market index in most cases can be simply like your S&P 500 or in there's a US like stocks, but if it is Singapore, it can be the Straits Times Index, right? So what's your return on market? Okay, so it's a collection of securities by a fund who owns the fund sponsor and required to place all investment within the asset category in a single passive managed portfolio. Of course, the simplest example is that in Singapore is the Straits Times Index, but you know when you do a very sophisticated portfolio, you can actually create your own market index, right? It can be things like, oh, maybe it's 50% of uh, Straits Times Index, 50% of S&P because the portfolio is split between Singapore and US 50-50, let's just say. And so we can create a market index. And these are market returns. Your style returns is basically the difference between your return on the benchmark index and your market index. So what does this mean? So let's think about it first, right? Let's think about what does it really mean, style return. So you have your market index, which is like S&P 500, and you create a benchmark which your portfolio is going to benchmark on, right? So by comparing your benchmark, which you have created with a market like S&P 500, you can determine how much of the return between your benchmark and your market index is caused by how you actually structure your benchmark, right? And in this case, structuring your benchmark is your style. Does everyone understand this? Because this is important. Because later we'll continue talking about style and all. So I'll repeat again. You have your own portfolio, right? This is your, because you manage a portfolio. There's a portfolio. Your portfolio is benchmarked on a benchmark index. This benchmark index is created by you, right? As a benchmark. And your benchmark index can be compared to a market index, which is S&P 500. So your benchmark can be different from your market index simply because your benchmark is created for that portfolio that you're managing. And in this case, the difference between your benchmark and your market index gives you a unique style of your portfolio. Okay? And that's why it's called style return. Now, your active return becomes the return on your actual portfolio. Remember, your portfolio and your benchmark, right? Because remember, you have a benchmark and then you manage a portfolio. And depending on what you do your portfolio, recall, you can do a lot of things your portfolio. You can do things like tactical asset allocation. You can do things like rebalancing. You can do many things to your portfolio. And if we compare the returns on your portfolio versus the benchmark that you have created, we can determine how much of these returns is active returns. Active meaning you have actively changed the asset allocation based on some tactical strategies, right? So This is your active return. Any questions regarding the three returns that we talk about? Style, active, and your market. So understanding this is important because later we will use these terms and then it might get very confusing after a while if you're not clear what is a benchmark, what is a market, and what is a portfolio. So there are three things: portfolio, benchmark, and your market. All right, I guess we are good. So the idea is that by determining the three returns, we can actually kind of pass out, what is affecting your returns. Could it be a style drift, right? So, by determining style returns, we can see, oh, is the returns dropping from the style? It could be a style drift. And when we have a style drift, there's something that we're concerned about, because if it drifts away from what we require in the IPS, then we are violating the IPS, and we might lose our job as a portfolio manager. Property of a valid benchmark. This is a bit of comments. You can read through them. Basically, you need to be measurable, unambiguous. Yeah, there's some comments, not too important. Now, types of benchmark, right? So remember I mentioned that benchmark are created to benchmark your portfolio to. So your benchmark could be something as simple as absolute benchmark, right? What is the percentage which you need to meet, exceed a target? It can be a manager universe benchmark, meaning you're compared with other managers, right? Other portfolio managers. It can be a broad index benchmark, which means that you create a benchmark that constitute, various assets. It can be a style index benchmark where if your portfolio is largely created of, let's say, small cap companies, then you create a small cap benchmark, right? That matches your portfolio style. It can be a factor model index benchmark. And what's this? Basically, in layman terms is, you run a regression based on various factors. So factors, when you run the regression, y equals the simplest form, y equals mx plus c, mx and x plus c. And in this simple case, there's only one x, but in a regression, you can have x1 plus x2 plus x3, etc. So these are all your factors giving you your y, right? Y meaning giving you your returns, and x are your factors affecting your y. Regression model generally, assumes, I think we talked about it in the last lecture as well, a parametric kind of approach. Parametric meaning that we parameterize the distribution. So it's either a normal distribution or straight line. Generally, a regression is a straight line. And therefore, there are some limitations. It's hard to kind of explain certain returns in straight line, right? And recall in the last lecture, we talked about things like options. We talk about things like forwards, and we know that options are non-linear, right? We have a non-linear returns on options, and especially if we create things like protected put or like a protected put, which cause even more issues. So the idea is that a factor model, might be a bit tough to actually evaluate the portfolio. We can do a return-based kind of benchmark where we kind of determine, a combination of the style index and check what's the account. Can you explain? Okay, we have a comment. Okay, explain what's a regression model. So a regression model in the most like a layman term, a simple form is y equals mx plus c, right? So basically what a regression model is, you have various points on the line, we do a scatter plot, and what we do, we run a regression, meaning we run a line, right? Straight like this. And in this sense, this is the best fit line. Recall your secondary school, what's the best fit line based on your scatter plot. And this best fit line is equals to y equals to mx plus plus c, and this y equals mx plus c is, in a sense, a regression, the simplest form of a regression, right? But we know that in this simple case, y equals mx plus c, there's only one x, right? A regression is very powerful because regression we can have multiple x's. Okay? So a regression basically is a scatter plot, and then we run a straight line across. And like I mentioned, because in a regression type of scenario, we generally assume a straight line, even though we can have other parametric and non-parametric kind of regression as well. That's a bit on more advanced side in economics. And we can do that. However, it's a bit more tricky. It's very hard to explain the meaning of a normally distributed regression line. Let's just put it that way. It's very hard to explain. So, sorry, if you're interested in regression, I encourage you to take on more econometrics courses in your program, and it gives you a very good idea of regression. So just for understanding, when we do a regression, what happens is that, let me just erase this. Just this will not be tested. So if you don't want to listen, it's fine. But the idea is that when we run a regression, we have y equals to, let's say, we use alpha x1 plus beta x2 plus, let's say, gamma x3, right? Let's say they have three factors, right? That's why it's a four-factor model. And the thing is, let's say we have a three-factor model, which means three x's, and we usually have an error term here. And the thing about regression is that by determining, so if you're interested, you'll learn that by determining the distribution of your error, we can determine, or we can force the regression to a certain distribution. Meaning what? If we can determine the error as a normally distributed error, your regression becomes normally distributed, right? So your regression becomes something like a normally distributed, and you have a line that cuts through, like something like this, right? Of course, normal distribution is the simplest one. We can have things like exponential, this as well, and it has different forms of regression. Okay? And the idea of a regression, there's one last comment, is that when we run the line through the regression, we are trying to determine what is this, the gamma, the beta, and the alpha. Why? Because by determining the gamma, beta, and alpha, we can determine how much percentage is affecting y. So let's say alpha is 10, let's say 20, and 5, right? So we know that for every change of x1, which is one factor, will affect y by 10. For every change of x2, which is another factor, can be anything, can be maybe interest rate, right? And for every change in interest rate, which is x2, it will affect y, which is the return on your stock, on your portfolio, because interest rate return, right? By 20. X3, maybe let's say inflation. Let's make some example, right? Where for every change in x3, which is inflation, you will change your portfolio return by 5, right? So this is what I'm trying to say here. Of course, this is a simple example of a straight line regression. If we assume a normally distributed error term, then our comments on the increase or decrease changes, right? So if it's a normally distributed, we need to take inverse norm to determine the number. But that's out of the syllabus, so let's not talk about that. Any other questions regarding regressions? Have you all done regression in your statistic course? Yes? Oh, okay. Yeah. Then this is just, I guess, a recap. Okay, so a customize, you just customize your benchmark based on the security in your portfolio, right? You just customize it. So, uh, quality. Okay, so we have talked about type of benchmark. Now, quality of benchmark. The first thing that we're going to talk about is systematic risk, which is your beta here, right? So the aim is for minimal systematic risk in the benchmark relative to the portfolio. So the between the benchmark and the portfolio, you must have um, similar systematic risk. And we know that systematic risk beta generally is mean reverting. Mean reverting means it goes towards one, right? One is the market beta, right? So generally a beta will not be very high for very long. If they're very high for things like maybe a high risk portfolio, but as time goes by, it should revert towards one. So there's a comment here. So the correlation between active and style return, recall what we talked about the three type of returns, should not be different from zero. What does this mean? It means that your active return and your style return should be correlated. So it should not be zero correlation. And it makes sense, right? In the sense that your style return, which is based on your um, benchmark versus your was it benchmark versus the market? Yeah, benchmark versus the market must be very similar to, or not similar, but correlated to how you actively manage a portfolio, right? Because your active return is based on your portfolio versus minus your benchmark, right? So the comment here is that there should be some correlation. It can't be that your style return has no correlation to your active return. In normal sense, they should be correlated because the style affects your or how your so your active return affects how what style you have in your portfolio. A tracking error for a good benchmark should be less than a tracking error relative to the index. Basically, the idea is that tracking error is the differences, right? Let's say your benchmark increased by 10, your portfolio should also increase by 10, right? So that's minimal tracking error. If let's say your portfolio, your benchmark increased by 10, your portfolio increased by 5, then you have some tracking errors because it does not match equally, or does not increase equally. So good benchmark should have very little tracking error. Similar characteristics in terms of risk, yeah, it should be the same characteristics generally. Coverage. So a benchmark should have high benchmark security market value as opposed to the portfolio value. So basically the thing is there should be similar kind of coverage, right? Let's say your benchmark is I don't know, 500, 500 50 stocks in oil and gas, then your market portfolio should kind of the same similar kind of values. So I guess a comment here is that your benchmark turnover should not be too excessive compared to your portfolio that you manage. And in this case, a passive portfolio. So if it's passive, but your benchmark turnover is a lot, then it doesn't match your passive strategy, right? So then your correlation might become zero, as we talked about just in the last slide. So depending on, you need to choose a good benchmark that matches your portfolio style. Okay, maybe I just pause for a short while. Any questions on benchmark before we move on to the next thing on attribution and appraisal? So we have a few silos kind of topics in this last lecture. So we have covered benchmark now. Right? So maybe we move on to your attribution and appraisal. So there are two separate processes. Okay? Attribution. So what's attribution? Attribution is identifying the source of return relative to the benchmark. We're going to break down the source in terms of what's the value added. Okay? Appraisal is appraising the quality of your manager's relative performance, whether it's skill, ability, etc. So these are the definition, but let's go into detail. What's attribution first? Okay, so let's think about attribution. So for attribution, the main part is that there are two kinds of attribution that we need to consider. Macro attribution and micro attribution. So before we look at all the words, right, let's just understand what it means first. Macro attribution, okay, so how I like to think about this, right, is in layman terms. Let's try to think about this before we go into the details and the words and all. The idea is that macro attribution is what's happening in, let's say, S&P 500. Okay, so let's give an example here. I have $100. I'm going to invest everything in S&P 500, right? So when we invest in S&P 500, put $100 there. S&P 500 is managed by, I think, a BlackRock, like a fund house, right? Let's say a fund house. And that by kind of analyzing how the fund house that's managing S&P 500 is performing, how the management of S&P 500 is. S&P 500 might be not a so good case because it's more passive, but let's just say there's a bit of active kind of strategy there. We are able to do a macro attribution, right? So let's say my portfolio has 100% S&P 500. The returns could be due to the management of your stocks in S&P 500 by the fund house. So that's macro. Now, what is micro? Micro is that, okay, I buy S&P 500, right? However, occasionally I have some tactical asset allocation. I reduce my S&P 500 and I bring in some, I don't know, VOO, right? So more tech heavy indexes. So by doing so, that kind of returns becomes more of a micro attribution because it's me as like a manager of my own money managing the portfolio so that there are some returns, and this is called micro attribution. So there's macro and micro. So we need to differentiate where is the returns or performance coming from. Is it from the fund house level or is it from the investment manager? And we can see this example here, right? This whole component here is your micro attribution. Macro. And your micro attribution is the portion that your portfolio manager actually determines in terms of, let's say, tactical asset allocation that is affecting the returns. The whole part here is for your micro attribution. Macro attribution. So this is micro, this whole thing is macro. Okay, there are some kind of like comments, definition of macro attribution. So it's conducted at a fund sponsor level. At a fund sponsor level, analyzes the value added. So imagine, S&P 500 owned by BlackRock, and BlackRock, has a manages the S&P 500. So how they manage it kind of affects your returns on your portfolio if you have S&P 500 in your portfolio. So, when you look at things like S&P 500, we can see things like, oh, it's a passively managed 500 large cap companies. There's usually some, long-term kind of strategy, kind of asset allocation as well. There's some rebalancing strategy that's being used S&P 500. So all these will impact your returns on S&P 500, and therefore, if you do analysis on, let's say, the rebalancing strategy, this will be your macro attribution. So the goal is to gain insight on decision made by the sponsor, right? The sponsor, like BlackRock, which affects the return. So the fund sponsor determines the broad allocation of the asset um, across various styles offered by the manager, right? So your macro attribution inputs includes, your policy of allocation, right? So it could be things like S&P 500. It's the 500 large cap companies in the US, right? So that's a policy allocation. It could include things like, your rebalancing strategy, um, and of course, S&P 500, they have certain benchmarks as well, right? Okay, maybe S&P might not be a good example, but if you look at other kind of indexes, they do have benchmark towards S&P 500, right? So, for example, I think we mentioned a couple of lectures ago about the Sharia S&P 500. So the Sharia S&P 500 actually benchmark against S&P 500, and the idea of the Sharia S&P 500 is supposed to beat the benchmark. So the policy is that they're supposed to beat the benchmark by, I can't remember how many percent, but they're supposed to beat it. And they have an overweight of tech stocks in order to beat the S&P 500 as the portfolio benchmark. Um, any questions for macro attribution? You can read through that. These are some comments written down for you. So macro attribution decision making level based on various level of risk tolerance and complexity. So in a sense that um, at the start, this is the lowest level of complexity, very easy, right? Net contribution, risky asset category, and as we go down, it gets more and more complex, right? Allocation effect, how much each decision making level contributes to the fund change over evaluation period, meaning, the fund is very big, right? Like, let's say BlackRock is very big. There are various levels of decision making that's required to, kind of change the S&P 500 composition, let's just say, right? So, as we go lower in this order, these points, this becomes like the most complex, right? It's very complex. So even to change S&P 500 composition, it's very hard to happen. You need to go through many steps. So this is just what's true in decision making levels at the fund sponsor level. Okay, so that's macro attribution. So micro attribution is now conducting the attribution analysis on the manager. So remember the called layman term example I was trying to suggest. So you are now the $100 they put at S&P 500, you are going to assess whether you as a manager, are you managing the money well? Are you doing some tactical asset allocation to kind of boost your overall portfolio value? And so we do this at a investment manager level. Sometimes the manager could destroy value by, let's say, if you look at the market now, the worst performing stocks included, surprisingly, actually, this week included many technology stocks. simply because there was quite a bit of rally in technology stocks last week, right? So this week, as we approach Easter break, there's a bit of slowdown in the bull run for technology stocks. So if your distribution period is 1 week, which normally is not the case, those are more trading. But if it is 1 week, then um, this week, you as a portfolio manager, you have destroyed value for your portfolio because technology stocks um, are slowing down in terms of its bull run. So a portfolio added return, we need to do some calculations here, um, is determined by two components, right? First, we take the portfolio weight, so WPJ, times the return on the portfolio in that sector, minus the weight of the benchmark times the return on the benchmark in that sector, right? So why is there like this sector thing here? Because recall that a portfolio includes many stocks, right? So in a simple two stock scenario, it can simply be 30% in Apple or Meta, 70% in let's say GE, right? GE General Electrics. But remember we're doing portfolio. So we portfolio have many stocks. So we do by sector basis. So we need to do a summation of each sector. And we take the weight. In this case, it's not so simple as 30/70. It becomes a weight multiplied by return of the portfolio in that sector J. Right. So it becomes a bit more complex simply because it's a portfolio and not a simple example of two stocks like Meta and G 30/70. That's what it's trying to say here. We will have an example in a little bit to explain this, so do not worry. We'll go into more detail as well for this micro attribution. So by simply looking at the equation here, we know that by doing some overweight or underweight of certain sectors, we can gain some value, right? And these are known as tactical asset allocation, which is what is being stated here relative to the weight of the benchmark, right? So we can do some tactical asset allocation by overweighting certain sectors. So we also can, instead of just weighing the sector, we can actually also determine the security. So security means we go deeper. We look at the stock makeup, right? So let's say we talk about technology sector. How much percent is in Meta, how much in Amazon, etc. So the security returns relative to the benchmark of that sector. So we can add value by overweighing a good performing stock, destroy value by overweighing a poorly performing stock. Last but not least, there's a comment here that says that if your portfolio consists of every single stock in the whole universe, of course it's not possible, but if your portfolio is close towards the universe of stocks, universe meaning US, Germany, London, Singapore, or the whole universe of stocks in the world, then it becomes so diversified that your portfolio has no value, right? Then why, as a client, why should I approach you as a portfolio manager managing just the universe of stocks? You have no added value. A portfolio manager only adds value when it includes certain overweight or underweight certain sectors by having specific market expectations, that's what we talk about in lecture 2 or lecture 3. And from there, your portfolio is able to generate the alpha or hopefully alpha or smart beta, right, that we talked about previously. So if you have like a universally diversified portfolio, it's kind of useless. Now, let's go into each component of your micro attribution. So this is the full formula for micro attribution. Now let's try to dissect each component first. Okay, you know what? Maybe I see that time is almost 10. Let's take a break first. Uh, because we actually, I didn't realize we started at 8:30. We should have taken a break at 9:30, not 10. I thought we started at 9. So let's take a break now. And then we come back in, let's say, 7 minutes. So maybe 10:05. Then we continue on this uh, micro attribution. All right, welcome back. We have a short break. Um, Coffee or something. But let's continue. So we're talking about micro attribution. Let's look at the formula now and dissect the formula, right? So we have various components of micro attribution here that's happening, right? And let's try to understand them before we go into details. So we have three components: pure sector, within sector, and then we have this interaction term, right? Interaction between allocation and selection. So let's try to understand the formula before we go into the details. In the pure sector allocation, what are we comparing? Because we're interested in the sector count allocation, what we're comparing is, okay, we have the benchmark and the portfolio weights, right? And so with the benchmark and portfolio weights placed here, we want to compare the benchmark return versus the total benchmark return, which is RB here, right? So by considering the benchmark return versus the total benchmark return, we are able to determine the sector-related returns caused by the difference in the weights of the portfolio versus the benchmark, right? And that's why we get the pure sector, the sector allocation attribution, right? I hope you can see that. I'll just repeat again. By determining the, by taking the returns on the benchmark versus the total benchmark returns, by lessing them off, where we did here, one minus the other, and we multiply it by the weight of the portfolio minus the benchmark, we can determine how much of the returns is attributed purely to the sector that's been chosen. Right, so that's why it's called pure sector attribution or allocation in this case. So that's the first. The second one we should look at is this within sector. So within sector selection. So how do we understand this, right? So now we have the benchmark weight that is given here, the benchmark weight. And it's simply by taking the portfolio return minus the benchmark return in, of course, in the sector, right? So if within this sector, in one sector, we take the portfolio minus the benchmark, we multiply by weight of benchmark, meaning what? We are actually comparing in this sector, let's say J, what is the difference in the returns that's contributing to the attribution, right? So that's within the sector because we are comparing in the sector J, we take the portfolio minus the benchmark and then we use the weight of the benchmark. Okay. The last one, I guess, is the more complex one where we have the interaction happening between what? Between the weight, the difference in weight of the portfolio and the benchmark, and the difference in return between the portfolio and the benchmark. So it's more of an interaction term where the interaction between both of them will give you the allocation slash selection interaction. We have details and we have an example as well to explain how we use this formula. So let's look at each one in detail now. Okay. It might be a small repeat, but let's see the pure sector allocation, right? It's the difference between the weight of the portfolio and the weight of the benchmark, right? Multiplied by the difference between the return of the benchmark and the total return of the benchmark. Right? This one is total return. So RB is total return, the benchmark. By doing so, we basically assume that within each sector, the manager held the same security as the benchmark. Same security and the same proportion. That's why we can determine by, so think about it. If the manager holds the same security and the same proportion in the benchmark, then we can say that how much of the returns is just from the sector itself, right? It must be the same proportion. Then we can do the comparison between the benchmark and the portfolio. Now, of course, so this is an underlying assumption that needs to be true. Because if the manager holds different amount of security in the portfolio versus the benchmark, then we cannot get the attribution of the return purely from the sector. So in order for this pure sector allocation to work, they need to be the same, right? It's an assumption that needs to be made. So it's attributed, so the relative performance only attributable to the sector weight decision. So how much is being weighed in each sector that's causing the returns. Why we can determine, so it's again, I repeat, why we can determine the sector weighing decision is because in terms of the weight of each security in the benchmark versus the portfolio, is assumed to be the same. That's why by using this formula, we can determine the sector weighing decision. Within sector selection, so let's look at this third term here, which is easier. So there's also an assumption here that's happening. What's the assumption? The assumption is that the manager weight each sector in the portfolio in the same proportion as the overall benchmark. So between the portfolio and the benchmark, the weighing each sector is the same, right? So same percentage. So 50% in technology, 50% in technology for both the benchmark and the portfolio. So by making this underlying assumption, when we use this formula here, what is contributing to the relative performance? It is only the security selection decision. So for each sector, right, see the proportion is 50-50, 50 technology for benchmark, 50% technology for portfolio. What is contributing to the performance is what stocks you actually add in the technology basket in the benchmark versus what stock you have added in the technology basket in your portfolio, right? That's why you can get the within sector relative performance or attribution. The last component, which is the allocation and selection interaction. So basically, this is just a joint effect of the portfolio manager and security analyst division. So generally, this third component, right, is not very important because it doesn't give you specific details about is it within sector selection, is it a pure sector allocation kind of attribution. It's simply just a joint effect, right? So most of the time, if you do portfolio management, this joint effect is not so important because you cannot determine what is the actual effect. It's just a joint effect, right, of the portfolio management manager and security analyst division. So usually this term is not so important. We don't really care about it too much. But the first two that we discussed, that one we can really determine the attribution of the relative performance, whether is it to the sector or is it whether within the sector security selection is causing the relative performance. So this is a good example to kind of understand the numerics in the formula that we have just seen. So we are given a lot of information here, right? So let's look at what we're given first. We're given the portfolio weights. We're given the sector benchmark. Okay, so we have portfolio, we have the benchmark. We have the portfolio returns, we have the benchmark returns. Okay. We are also given the benchmark total returns and the portfolio total returns here. We are given some information on the performance attribution as well, pure sector allocation, within sector, total value added. All right, fine. Now, we need to calculate, number one, the pure sector allocation for consumer durables. So where are consumer durables first? So consumer durables are here, right? So we have a working here. So consumer durables for pure sector allocation. So what numbers do we look at? We need to consider first the weight of the portfolio minus the weight of the benchmark, right? So these two numbers. And then for pure sector, we need to consider the return on the portfolio here versus that means a different color, the total. Remember, I say the RB, which is the total return on the benchmark, which is what is given in the calculation here. So what's important is that, in your assessment, okay, calculation, that's fine. But what usually they want you to comment is what does this actually mean? So this part is important. You need to know how to explain, right? In your assessment, you need to know how to explain. So you need to say that decision to underweight the sector. So how do you know it's underweight? So underweight, let's look at this. The weight of the portfolio is 31.78 versus benchmark is 34.75. That's why it's underweight, right? So the decision to underweight your sector, consumer non-durables, that perform better overall than the overall benchmark result in a negative contribution to the performance of the portfolio relative to the overall benchmark. So because you have underweight your consumer non-durables, which actually perform pretty well, this has resulted in a negative performance to your portfolio. Any questions regarding this, the first calculation? I guess no. So let's go on to within sector allocation. So the next, what's the next question? Compute the within sector allocation return for technology. So now we're going to look at technology here, right? So a within sector allocation, what are we interested in? So we are interested in, let's just have a look. We are interested in two parts here, right? So we are interested in, first of all, the benchmark, right? Because WBJ, right? So we are interested in the WBJ, which is here, versus the returns, difference in return between the benchmark and the portfolio, which is given by this. Right? You can see here. And recall what is the underlying assumption here. The underlying assumption is that we supposed to have the same proportion of each sector, in this case technology, the same proportion of stocks, right? Let's say it's 30% technology, in this case 16%, right? 16% technology in benchmark, 60% technology in portfolio. And so we are able to determine the performance is due to the selection of securities in the technology sector that's causing your relative performance. So the comment here now, with the understanding of the underlying assumption that is required, the comment here is that the portfolio held technology stocks in the total performs better, because it's positive, better than the aggregated performance of the technology stocks contained in the benchmark, right? Because we are comparing the within the sector, right? So the selection of the securities of technology, if you look at the portfolio, the selection you have done is better in your portfolio compared to the benchmark, hence you get a 0.37% positive relative performance in your portfolio compared to your benchmark. Last but not least, we look at the interaction term. So again, I mentioned this is not very important. You need to know how to calculate, but it doesn't really mean much to a portfolio manager. Why? The interaction term is simply for technologies, is just this, right? These two interactions, the two things that's happening, right? So what is the relative interaction between the weight and the returns? So allocation and selection interaction. So we can calculate, sorry, you can calculate that using this, and it's just that the portfolio relative underweight and positive relative performance in technology sector result in negative contribution to the portfolio performance relative to the overall benchmark. This is an explanation. Again, this interaction term, there's nothing much to really discuss because you can't really understand much from a interaction. So I want to highlight that these are important for you to know how to explain. Typically, most questions, if you review past years, they kind of ask you to do some calculation and then they ask you to explain, right? Because the explanation part is the part that is a bit tricky. You need to really understand the concept of pure sector, within sector, and even the interaction in order to be able to explain. So I encourage you to really understand and be able to explain. Um, all right, so that's all for attribution. I think our last part is on appraisal. So appraisal, for some of you who have already started working, you know that performance appraisal is like every year as part of like the corporate life, right? So basically a performance appraisal is like, in your portfolio, do you get the returns based on your luck? Do you get it based on your skill? Do you use some kind of special analysis, maybe certain software, etc., right? So, how much revenue you generated relative to your risk. So this is where we need to calculate things like, your Sharpe ratio, we consider things like your M square, your Jensen alpha, which is what we're going to look at, right? Basically, the idea is that we need to determine, yes, maybe you perform very well in terms of the returns, but do you take excessive amount of risk? Do you breach the IPS, right? Maybe there is a Sharpe ratio, because Sharpe ratio is the risk and reward ratio, the Sharpe ratio requirement in your IPS, right? And you actually breach that. So there are some performance appraisal biases that's important. And in just a bit, we'll talk about the GBA. Psychological bias is one of the components that unfortunately most groups missed out in terms of your GBA. So I want to highlight that the idea of why we cover even like psychological bias is that it's important to highlight certain biases whenever we see a case, whenever we read certain comments in the case, right? So in the same form, performance appraisal, there are some biases as well. Right? So there are some bias in terms of things like, asset, if it's infrequently trade, maybe it's hard to kind of determine what is the forward-looking trajectory. Things like option pricing that we mentioned are non-linear. We cannot use the factor model. It's hard to determine the straight line kind of increment for the returns, let's say. There might be some survivorship count bias on the historical data as well. Right, so these are just a bit of biases that it's important to consider. And so let's look at the performance measure for your appraisal of your portfolio manager, right? And the basic idea is that we want to compare risk and return. So that's just by comparing risk and return, we can determine, yes, okay, your portfolio manager did very well, but is he or she taking on excessive amount of risk, right? So all these measures kind of do a risk and return kind of analysis in different ways. Okay, let's look at the first thing called Jensen alpha. So what's Jensen alpha? So Jensen alpha basically is a regression of the CAPM. So CAPM meaning your CAPM, which is your capital asset pricing model. So we do a regression on the CAPM. And let me just write down the CAPM for reference. So returns equals to beta times return on market minus risk-free rate plus risk-free rate, right? So this is your basic CAPM. Now, what do we do here? We do a regression instead. So can you see the similarities of your Jensen alpha to your CAPM model? But your CAPM, recall your CAPM is based on, did I bring the, no, I did not. So I think it's the next few slides, but recall the CAPM is based on your security market line, right? So your security market line is a straight line, y equals to mx plus c, right? So it's a very basic form. Now your Jensen alpha mentioned when we talk about regression just now in the start of the lecture is a bit more sophisticated because we do not only assume a straight line and one x variable and one y variable, right? In a regression, we can do many things, right? As many variables as one. So the Jensen alpha is a bit more sophisticated. It considers the this thing called alpha, which is what we want to calculate. Unfortunately, whenever you do a regression, because it's not a closed-end equation, there will be a random error, right? Epsilon that we see here. So what we're trying to determine here in this regression, when we do a regression, is determine what is this alpha, which is what we are trying to find. And this alpha provides the difference between the account, which the portfolio returns, that's required to compensate for the systematic risk taken, right? Why systematic risk? Because in your securities market line, we are plotting the x-axis as beta. So I think I did mention the security market. I did draw, yeah, here. This is a security market line. So recall security market line. In your CAPM model, your x-axis is beta, and y-axis is your returns, right? So your Jensen alpha basically is comparing, so I'll just flip back to the other slide. It's comparing your portfolio returns that's required based on your systematic risk. So based on your beta, right? Or your x-axis, because you are still plotting it based on x-axis. Yeah, right? This is your x, this is beta. So we do a regression to find your alpha. And this is your Jensen alpha. Okay, so the idea is that as we know what alpha is, right? We talk about alpha in like, I think, lecture 3. Alpha is your abnormal returns, right? So in the sense that your benchmark should have 0 alpha, right? Your benchmark is just a benchmark, but your portfolio is the one that's supposed to have alpha. Which is why we have active management, right? To get the alpha. Your benchmark offers at 0 alpha, 0 Jensen alpha. And to determine the alpha, we use this regression. So, of course, a manager with a larger alpha means that he is more skilled. Maybe he has superior information. He's able to tweak the portfolio to get more alpha. And hence, in that sense, in the appraisal, he should be appraised better. Because based on the alpha, using the regression model, we are able to say that, okay, we are able to quantitatively say that he actually done a better job compared to another portfolio manager, which has a lower Jensen alpha based on the regression that is being ran. Right? So we remember that at this point in time, we are talking about appraisal, right? So we have all the data already, right? We have all the, in a sense, exposed meaning what? The so-called historical data of the portfolio performance. So we are now using the data to run the regression to see what's the alpha of the manager, and a bigger alpha, the better. I'll pause here. Any questions? Very good. Okay, I'm glad it's clear. Because sometimes I feel that this, attribution, performance management kind of discussion can be a bit abstract. So I'm like for me, I really like to try to make it very applicable and try to make it more understandable, right? Um, instead of very abstract kind of concept. Okay, so that's one method, Jensen alpha. Next, we have the channel ratio. And I think this is missing. It's supposed to be a beta here. Just zoom in and a minus here, right? So it's supposed to be a beta. Let me just erase this. Maybe in your slide it's not missing, but here's a beta here, right? And so the trainer ratio relies again on the security market line, and it's simply the Sharpe ratio. We call it Sharpe ratio or trainer ratio. And it simply just gives you the risk and reward ratio based on the systematic risk, right? So this is equals to the some people know it as the Sharpe ratio with an E at the end, right? And it's derived from the slope of your security market line as given here, right? It's a slope of the security market line. And this was covered back in lecture 2. Small correction is not equal to, sorry, this is small correction not equal to Sharpe ratio, because I kind of confused, because the Sharpe ratio actually is similar, but it uses standard deviation. So these are missing. So Sharpe ratio is the same as the trainer ratio, only that the denominator, instead of beta, we use total risk, and total risk is given by your standard deviation. And whenever we plot the returns on x-axis over standard deviation, this would be the capital market line, CML, right? And we talk about CML also in lecture 2. So Sharpe ratio, trainer ratio, very similar. One of it considers total risk, the Sharpe ratio does. The trainer ratio considers systematic risk only. And of course, the higher the ratio, the better, right? Meaning that for each unit of risk that you take, you have more returns. Right, so this is a recap of the capital market line. We're not going to discuss this again because we have did quite a lot of discussion on this in lecture 2. Now, I think this is again missing. Sure why. This is supposed to be a standard deviation. Yeah, like this. Okay. So it's a standard deviation. So information ratio is similar to your Sharpe ratio, only that what is different? Your Sharpe ratio assumes risk-free rate, but information ratio allows you to use a benchmark. What is the return on benchmark? So we're comparing return on portfolio versus return on benchmark, right? Sharpe ratio compares return on portfolio minus the risk-free rate. So what's the excess return over the benchmark? So the numerator gives the active return, right? Because when you compare the portfolio versus the benchmark, what you're getting is actually the active return. As we talked about, remember, in the middle of today's lecture, the active return, the style return, and market return. Again, this is missing. This, rewrite this. So the M square, what the M square is the M model, but instead of cat M, we replace it by replace the figure that is inside the bracket. So cap N is basically the return on market minus the risk-free rate, right? We replace this by the Sharpe ratio. So by doing so, we are able to determine the return if we consider the total risk. So a comment here, a skillful manager will generate M square that exceeds the return on the market index. So M square is exactly say a Sharpe ratio because it's derived from the Sharpe ratio as you can see here. Okay, so generally how if you refer to past year kind of assessment, generally how they would test you for this is they'll ask you to simply just calculate M square, calculate Sharpe ratio, calculate trainer ratio. So you just need to be very careful when calculation, making sure you do not make any mistakes in your calculation, right? And usually after you ask you to do some explanation, so you explain. Relatively, simple, I would say. Just need to be careful in terms of calculation. Okay, so this last part is this thing called GIPS, which is Global Investment Performance Standard. Is included in the lecture because the module follow closely to the CFA level 3. So basically just some like explanation of what GIPS is. There is a full explanation in your study guide, right? But we'll not go through every detail of global investment performance standard. So basically, it gives you some idea of ethical standards in terms of portfolio management, and how to make sure to spare competition, entry to barriers to entry, etc. Right? This is some just a comment you can look through it, not so important. Some characteristics as well. I just put here in the slides. Again, not too important. You can just have a look at it. Okay, this is something for you to read. Nothing much. And the thing is, I guess at the end of the day, portfolio management, as we proceed to the end of the course already, or the content that's required, it's really based on the idea of trust, right? Which is highlighted here. Because as a portfolio manager, you're handling a lot of money for your clients. And for some clients, this money could be hard-earned money, right? And for these kind of clients, they are more anxious and maybe they want more information as we talk about it compared to maybe a person that is a self-made entrepreneur who is more aggressive in terms of investment, right? And then we need to treat them differently as we talk about it in lecture 1. And so at the end of the day, portfolio management, it's a lot of people skills. At the same time, a large proportion of it is also based on very technical calculation. That's what we can see in things like modern portfolio theory, where we need to do really crunching the numbers, as well as things like rebalancing, which we need to crunch the numbers as well, or risk management, where we need to understand derivative products, right? So it's really a combination of both quantitative, qualitative, component of IPS, at the same time also relationship management, where we need to talk to our clients, making sure things like psychological bias is being taken into account so that we do not make any mistakes in our portfolio management. Right? There's some comments about issues with portfolio management and the need to regain client trust. And this is the final concluding slide, right? Where it says that, first of all, we recap again what is portfolio management. We need to do the IPS, understand our goal, and the IPS basically creates the plan, it creates the mandate of what we can do for our client. After creating the mandate, we might have some market expectation, and then we create a portfolio based on certain theory. And in this course, we learn about modern portfolio theory, which gives us a basis of allocating assets. And from there, we monitor the portfolio, right? We do some tactical asset allocation, we do some rebalancing, making sure that our portfolio not exceeds, but actually meets the requirement of the IPS slash our clients. And of course, stay on course, and you are being appraised after that. That's what we talked about today. Okay, so that concludes today's lecture on the module as well on portfolio management. I hope you have enjoyed it so far. Um, any comments? Okay. All right. So maybe if there's no comments at the moment, let's take another quick 7 minutes break, and then we come back. We talk about the GDA. And then also hopefully we can answer any questions you might have for the finals. Okay. So let's take a break, and we come back in 7 minutes. All right. Welcome back to the next part of today's lecture. Let's look at the GBA. Maybe before we talk about the GBA, do we have any questions regarding the GBA? Any clarification you'd like to say? No? Okay. So generally the class did pretty well. I think group one and group two did um I think the best. But I think overall most of you all did relatively well. Um, and also I know the GBA is quite a substantial portion, the grades. So yeah, if you want a good reference, I highly recommend to reach out to members from group one or group two to see the kind of details that's included in the GBA, right? So general comments on GBA. First, it's important to have a good ITS. Um, so groups that did well generally have wrote quite a bit for the ITS. Um, at the same time, also have both qualitative and quantitative. So there is, I think, one group that did not consider quantitative components in their answers. Unfortunately, that means that you lose quite a lot of marks because a significant proportion of the marks is dedicated to quantitative explanations. So you need to do things like calculate, make some calculations, right? And hopefully you use tools that was taught in class, such as using the corner portfolios. I think um, either group one or group two or both of them actually did do the plot the portfolios out. Um, and by doing so, you get the quantitative marks because there are significant portion of your marks that's located to quantitative. And so if you miss that, unfortunately, I couldn't give you marks for the quantitative component, right? So important to take note that whenever you're faced with case, please make sure that, especially for case like this, where they give you actually a lot of quantitative information, you need to consider quantitative answers as well, right? Meaning do some calculations. Um, a comment is that also it'll be, I think only one group talked about psychological bias. And the reason why psychological bias is important here because there is a portion of the case that talk a lot on the composition of the board for the pension. So the composition kind of is important uh, for the considerations of biases because we see that each of the board members are from different background and they might have certain biases that affect the decisions based on the case, right? So, fortunately, I think not many groups talk about that, and therefore you lose quite a bit of marks on, or not quite a bit, but just a small portion of marks on psychological biases. The good thing is that in your finals, unlikely there'll be such a long case. So it's really more on understanding because I think there's no time for them to test you on a full case like this. It's only once during the group project. So maybe I'll just do a quick um brief overview of the case, like what are the important points to take note. And then along the way, feel free to stop me if you have any questions, right? So and if not, then we might finish early if there are no other questions regarding the finals. Because I understand. So the Saturday is a long weekend. You might want to have some other plans as well. All right. So in this case, we have this province called OH, right, in Eastern Canada, which is actually where I am in Canada as well. And the idea is that this province does a lot of resource extraction here, right? So I think, unfortunately, I think none of the group highlighted this important point on resource extraction, where if you have a economic background, econs background, right, you kind of know that whenever we think about resource extraction, there are a lot of economic issues related to it, right? And one of the biggest issue is this thing called the Dutch disease. So I'm not sure if have anyone heard of this thing called Dutch disease? Yeah. Oh, that's very good. So that's good that you have heard of it. So the Dutch disease uh, is typically for countries, in this case, province, that rely heavily on resource extraction. And maybe for those that do not know what it is, I'll just give a quick overview, right? So Dutch disease came from Netherlands, Dutch. Um, and what happened was that when an economy focused on resource extraction, we know that resource is finite, right? We cannot extract resource forever. However, at the period of time where we are extracting resource, a lot of the re, human capital, investments are all focused on resource extraction. And the problem with resource extraction is this. First of all, it's finite. Next, it does not require a lot of manpower, right? It is not like um, a bank, right? A bank where you need a lot of departments, you need a lot of people to actually generate revenue, right? Resource, okay, you build a machinery, you have a capex, you build a refinery, maybe you employ some people to run the refinery, right? And so because of the reliance on resource extraction, first of all, your investments, which are kind of limited as well, your investments are not infinite, they're finite. Investments are channeled towards resource extraction. And at the same time, your people are being trained only to do resource extraction. And you don't employ a lot of people. So what happens is that there's a neglect of other industries um, in the province. For example, it could be things like tourism, it could be things like maybe even finance, education, right? And because of this, um, the it is termed the Dutch disease because instead of the economy becoming more prosperous, they become heavily reliant on oil extraction, which is finite. And eventually, of course, if the oil stops, if they did not divest their investments to other sectors, the town or the province will not be able to function. Now, another problem with Dutch disease is also if you rely heavily on resource, especially like oil and gas, logging, what happens is that your currency appreciates relative to foreign currency because people want to buy resource, right? When more people buy your resources, they need to pay you in. There's an increased demand for your currency, and then they pay you in your currency, right? So your exports of products that are not resources to be manufacturing will become less competitive. And when it becomes less competitive, it further impacts other industry and it further drives other industry out of business and hence focus back on to the resource extraction business in that country or in this case in that province. So that's the idea of the whole Dutch disease, right? And in this case, when we first just read the initial comments, we know that OH, unfortunately, seems like they're in this situation of Dutch disease. There is a hint in the case as well. If you scroll, so I'm just going to jump a bit, but we'll go back. There is a case here on the Norwegian pension fund. That's mentioned here. It's just a one-liner thing, but this is a small hint on the Dutch disease as well. But the idea that the Norwegian pension fund is quite interesting because Norway used to be heavily reliant on resource extraction as well. But Norway is one of the rare cases where the country managed to get out of this vicious cycle of resource reliant. And one of the ways they do it is to establish the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, where money from the resources are invested in this wealth fund, which has a time horizon. Again, it's also a portfolio with time horizon more than 100 years, right? So multiple generations. And the idea is that the money invested in this wealth fund, which is the largest in the world now, would pay for other, subsidize other sectors. And so this is a very smart way, right? So I think unfortunately, um, maybe some of you all know about this Dutch disease, but unfortunately, this component on highlighting the positive case of Norway at juxtaposed against the Dutch disease was not really mentioned. But there was not too much marks given there. So it's still fine, but you have been good if you have this background in order to tackle the case more robustly. Okay. So this is some background on Norway and resource rich countries. So even here they already say about the dependence on oil and gas. So there are some comments on oil spill. They have the pension, okay. So in this component here, it'll be good if you have mentioned some things about pension. Recall in lecture one, we talked about pension as well. We talked about funded status, unfunded status, what is the number of active members. I think only one group mentioned or did some calculations about determining whether the pension is fully funded, unfunded, or might be unfunded in the future because of the proportions of active versus inactive, an amount of pensioners that is being that's receiving pension. So that was actually covered in lecture one. So if you have mentioned something like this, that was pretty good. So there's some information on the funds, objective, strategy, ESG considerations as well. Okay. One thing I want to highlight for, again, a general comment for case is that we want to avoid repeating what's in the case, right? You do not need to repeat what's the case. You also do not need to define or explain concepts, right? So even your finals, right? Whenever you have short answer questions, just go straight to the point, answer the question. You don't need to define, let's say, what is a defined contribution plan. You don't need to define what is it, right? The marker kind of already know. Explain what does it, how does it relate to the question, or in this form, the case, and yeah, answer straight to the point. Like for example, ESG consideration. You don't try to repeat what's there. Just tackle the issue of the oil spill. How does it affect ESG? What kind of assets should you divest? I think most of you all suggest to divest your ETFs, right? So whenever we think about ESG considerations, I also like to throw a point out here for you to think about, right? And if you all have any comments, feel free to put in the chat or even unmute yourself. Is that yes, there's a lot of, it's very easy to just say, let's divest the oil refineries, right? Let's not do oil. But there is a social cost to divestment as well, right? Social cost meaning, okay, if you don't want to extract oil from this in this province, right? Then what are the people going to do? Are people going to lose their jobs? So a good report should also tackle the social aspect of saying a divestment is good, right? So instead of just saying, okay, let's divest. Okay, you can say that, but let's consider, okay, if I divest, my people lose a job. Should you substantiate the answer in the sense of, okay, let's develop the tourism industry. So I think some groups did that, right? Say, oh, we do develop a tourism industry so that people can upskill or can be reskilled to tourism instead of um, uh, oil and gas, right? Um, and then, of course, in this case, there are quite a lot of issues because the tax on the royalties on oil and gas is very high. So, what other sectors can replace the oil and gas? That is another question that we need to tackle and answer, right? So, before we conclude things like let's divest, we need to be very careful to consider all aspects of um, the case. Any comments? Maybe no. We have some fun overview of the real estate, commodities. There's some direct investments. Okay, so these are the investments now, right? We have this uh North White Rose, or you call Muskrat Fall, which is a structure project. I think most group mentioned about how the infrastructure project is very positive. And then maybe the oil core mining is not so. I think most group mentioned this. Most group also mentioned the importance of the St. John Airport infrastructure project. Um, and I think a lot of groups also take a stand that in terms of the ETF, we should avoid having oil and gas exposure in the ETF, which all makes sense. So it's very good. Okay, so having all these details here, the quantitative aspect is where you need to do the calculation to determine asset allocation. So I think those that did very well when research what are the returns. So there are a few ways to do it, right? So there are some that did scenario analysis where you say a scenario of this, uh, equity, how much increase income, how much real estate, and you do a scenario analysis to say, okay, this scenario is the best, right? And then there are groups that did the modern portfolio theory. That one, of course, I feel is a bit more robust because scenario analysis is really based on what you choose, right? Um, unless you say you do like a Monte Carlo simulation of scenarios, meaning do like 1,000 scenarios and then you determine the top three best scenarios. I think that one might be a bit more convincing. But if you do like three scenarios, then the question is how you know that three is the right one, right? Of course, there's not so much high requirements to do Monte Carlo and all because it's not taught. But just something to think of. There's some comments here. Impact of divestment. Okay, they mention about the impact economy, um, so federal tax. Yeah, this is what we mentioned earlier about government spending, about the royalties. See any interesting part point down. So okay, there are some groups here. So this one is the one that is interesting. Psychological bias. All right. Maybe I'll just pause here. Any questions or like any comments that you'd like to add? If not, that's all I actually want to mention about the case, unless there are more clarifications, we can discuss the case more. Nope. Okay, very good. It's okay. Okay, maybe we are all very all good. Okay, so okay, we are done with that GBA. If you have any specific questions, do not hesitate, drop me an email. Usually I reply pretty fast, and then we can discuss and look at what your concerns on the GBA. So maybe we can have any questions regarding or concerns regarding the finals. We like to voice certain maybe if you have some questions regarding the materials, we can go through. Any recommendations? So generally, I would say, as of most module, right, try to focus on the last few lectures, right, that has not really been tested yet. Definitely, what covered today, definitely what we talk about rebalancing becomes very important. Um, IPS, like I mentioned, I think previously, unlikely they're going to test you write a full IPS, right? There's no time to do that. But they still could ask you certain portions of the IPS, right? Mention about things like I noticed they like to ask, this is just my own empirical kind of observation. They like to ask things like the risk tolerance and risk willingness, right? How do you determine risk tolerance? You need to talk about willingness and ability. So that things like that, you need to make sure you measure ability and willingness to get both of the marks. Because if you miss one, basically 50% of the marks score. There's no like leeway to give you more marks. Actually, that's a good question. So the thing is, I think previously last lecture you asked about there's someone asked about now it's a closed book and we're supposed to you write the answers. So I reached out to the school and the school like mentioned that as an instructor we should not comment about like what can be done in the exam because we don't want to confuse you. Like the best is to directly reach out to the school on like what can be done, what cannot be done because the exam is all centralized, right? Like even for me, I have no access to the exams um at all. So because it's a closed book, I don't think you can because it's a closed book, no, right? Because what I understand is a closed book, so I don't think you can prepare Excel sheets before that. And there is formula sheet. Yeah, I know there is formula sheet. But I don't think you can prepare Excel beforehand because it's a closed book. It's not like you can put in answers right in Excel. Yeah. So I'm just thinking logically, no, I don't think you can. Yeah. If not, you can put all your so-called all the solutions, not really solutions, but whatever we have learned in Excel and then bring it in. It is hard to remember. Uh, I guess you just have to study. I think maybe if you try to do it from like lecture one, lecture two, lecture three, like chronologically, might be easier because you realize that like in the last two lectures, we actually use a lot of knowledge from the past lectures, right? So a lot of the theories build on each other. So if you do it maybe chronologically as what we have covered, it'll be easier. to kind of study. And I think one of the tips maybe is like what we have covered. Recall, I always keep on mentioning that they are all tools for portfolio management, right? So the concept is that um, they are all hoping to equip you with tools to answer the question. So even in like an assessment, short answer question, if you find that a question is a bit generic, you don't know, try to maybe narrow down, okay, what tool should I use to answer this question? And once you narrow down to that tools, it will help you frame your answer better and help you um, answer the question correctly, right? Because sometimes if you read a question and you don't know what part of the what part they are trying to test you on, right? Then maybe you write off point or you miss the point. So yeah. So in case as you review the slides again, maybe even the lecture recording, if you do have any questions, drop me a message, email. I will reply. Um, help you clarify. Of course, try not to do it like a day before, because due to the time difference, usually takes a couple of. If I'm asleep and you're awake, I only can reply when I'm awake. So do not last minute rush, and then unfortunately you might not receive the reply on time. But if you do have any questions, drop me a message. Okay, any last comments? Wait, let me just pause the recording first.